Another important part of speech anatomy are the bones of the skull, bones that surround the brain, as well as provide attachment points for muscles of the face. These include 4 bones that are pretty easy to know the location of: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal, because they match the lobes of the brain underneath. 2 more challenging bones that we'll start with: the ethmoid bone and the sphenoid bone, which are a couple of space aliens living in your head, basically. The ethmoid bone has a perpendicular plate that makes up the upper portion of the nasal septum. It has a cribriform plate that makes up the upper wall of the nasal cavity. The orbital plate is on the lateral sides, articulating with the frontal bone and with the maxilla. Helps define a bit of the shape of the skull. And then hanging down from that cribriform plate and medial to the orbital plate are the superior and middle nasal concha. These create cavities for turbinates and mucous membranes in the nasal cavity that provide a function to warm air for respiration. Taking a look at the images to the right, you can see the ethmoid bone kind of peeking through the hole for the nasal cavity. So it's a bone that's located in the very center of your head, and it's in sort of the middle part of the nasal cavity as well. Here is a view taken off the internet showing the ethmoid bone location there in the nasal cavity. You can see some of the rest of the skull around it, the palate at the base of this image. The medial part, which is the image on the right, is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid that helps define the division between the 2 halves of the nasal cavities, the nasal septum. The orbital plates out on the side of the ethmoid bone are shown on the left. They help define the upper and upper side walls of the nasal cavity. The sphenoid bone is another pretty funky looking bone in the middle of your head. This bone is in the posterior part of the nasal cavity, just above the jaw. The main part of the sphenoid bone is a corpus that has a variety of sinuses in it and articulates posteriorly with the occipital bone of the skull. The sphenoid bone kind of looks like a moth, and so it has projections that are called wings. The greater wings extend laterally and anteriorly. They connect up with the frontal and temporal bones on the skull. And also in a side view, a lateral view of the skull, you can actually see a little bit of that wing of the sphenoid bone on the external skull. There are also lesser wings that extend superiorly and laterally. They almost look like little antennae on the moth to me, that provide a channel for the optic nerve from the eyes heading back toward the occipital lobe. Looking at the sphenoid bone in a mid-sagittal section, there are lateral and medial pterygoid plates that extend inferiorly from it that help form posterior lateral walls of the nasal cavity and also provide points of attachment for our pterygoid muscles. The frontal bone on the skull is the bone in over the frontal lobe. It has a nasal portion where it connects up to the nasal bones of the face, an orbital portion which defines the shape of the upper part of the eye socket, and zygomatic processes that connect it up to the zygomatic bone. Connection between the frontal bone and the parietal bone happens at the coronal suture, and some of these skull sutures are relatively important to keep track of as they get referred to in a variety of places. I could also note here in this lower image you can see that bit of the greater wing of the sphenoid bone in our side view of the skull. So it's not a very large part of the skull and not a part of the skull that's really very visible from the outside because of muscles that are over it. But if you think of the skull as a container for the brain, it does help form that container. The parietal bones are the upper sides of the skull. They are joined at the midline at the sagittal suture that matches our sagittal plane orientation for things. Parietal bones connect to the occipital bone posteriorly at the lambdoidal suture. And the parietal bones connect to the temporal bones laterally at the squamosal suture. The occipital bone forms the posterior and inferior part of the skull. There's a hole in the occipital bone called the foramen magnum that the spinal cord passes through, and it would be, immediately inferior or below this hole where you would have the cervical vertebrae. The occipital condyles are the connection to those cervical vertebrae, and they articulate with C1, that atlas bone from the vertebral column. We also have a connection from the occipital bone to the temporal bones at the occipitomastoid suture, which might seem a little bit obscure, but there is a mastoid process in that region on the temporal bone that's important. We'll have a few muscles attaching to that, so that will become relatively easy to remember. The temporal bones make up the lower sides of the skull. It has a couple of distinct portions to it. There's a squamous portion, which is more anterior and superior, that connects up to the parietal bone. And then the more posterior and inferior part of the temporal bone is the mastoid portion, which has the mastoid process on it, connects up to the occipital bone. Within the mastoid process of the temporal bone, we have tympanic and petrous portions that contain the external auditory meatus and the cochlea and the semicircular canals that make our auditory and vestibular system. So anatomy of the temporal bone is extra important for the audiologists. Anteriorly, the temporal bone has a zygomatic process that connects to the zygomatic bone and creates the zygomatic arch. There is also the mastoid process that I've mentioned before in the mastoid portion of the bone. This is going to be an attachment point for a lot of our muscles that would hold up the skull. Probably most of those were in the suprahyoid muscles that we talked about before, or will be part of our articulatory muscles for jaw movement that we'll talk about in this chapter. There is also a more spear-like projection, the styloid process, where things like the stylohyoid muscle connect. Here is a scanned image of a temporal bone with everything else removed, given the marking of the squamous portion, the mastoid part, location of the styloid process, the zygomatic process. Anterior on this image would be in the direction marked by C. Here is a different view of the skull, in this case the skull of an infant, but all those same bones that have been talked about for the skull as well as for the face are represented here. In this case, anterior is to the right, where the nasal bones, the maxilla, and the mandible are located, but also we have the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal bones clearly marked on here as well. There are greater gaps between those bones at those sutures because in the infant those wouldn't have become fully fused yet.